I'll say, okay, so if you would just state your name, when and where you were born, and a little bit of information about your parents, when and where they were born.
My name is Annemarie Annunziata, and I was born in Newark, New Jersey. I'm the firstborn American in this family. My parents were from Italy. They're from an area that is called the Puglia, which is on the Adriatic side of the country. And up until maybe the last 10 years or so, it was an area that most non-Italians, and even some Italians, didn't think was all that interesting. But it turns out to have been quite interesting. Among other things, the language I heard spoken in my home was a dialect that was made up in part by French words, if you can believe it. Because if you know, this is south, this is not in the northern part of the country where French is often found in adjoining areas. This is south and in the mountains. So the vocabulary was French, but it was pronounced as though it were Italian. For example, the best one I can give you is my maiden name is Petiti. There is no word that has anywhere near a comparison to such a root, petite. That is clearly French. But the Italians would never just leave the last letter unpronounced. So they pronounced petit as petite, which then got spelled with a double T and an I, P-E-T-I-T-T-I. So Olga and Nicholas Petiti were born in an isolated town in the mountains of this region. They didn't really know each other there. They met when they both came to the United States much later. My mother was 18, and she was the last of 13 children, and only one of 3 of whom her father thought ought to come to the United States to help the family get established. She was the caretaker for 2 boys, the brothers. My grandfather went back. My father was 15, and his family, the whole family, 4 boys, the parents, emigrated to I believe to Ohio first, or perhaps maybe it was Newark, and then my grandfather did some work in Ohio, worked on the railroad like a lot of immigrants at the time. And then eventually went back to Newark. My mother was in Bridgeport, Connecticut. She came from a family of artisans, tailors, and this is more than just being able to sew. My grandfather and my uncles on that side were basically fashion designers, and their biggest, their most important skill was making suits. Suits are really hard to make, especially for men. So she came from a tailoring artisan family in this small village. This is not in a large city. This is still a village. And my father's family were basically shepherds, and they had a lot of land. So they had goats and sheep. And they came here, and
What
I heard
prompted them to come?
I think it was economic, certainly. They had others who had been here. You know, we're talking probably the 30s, mid-30s, but it was mostly economic. And so their early life had to do with economic stability, of course. My father and his next brother in age became interns in a factory where they learned the skills. It's a machine factory, and they made little steel parts. They worked with steel and lots of oil, machine parts. And in a couple of years, they had learned enough of how to do it that they could start a factory of their own. This is what actually stabilized the family. There were the 4 brothers and their families, and the families that were engendered after. You know, I come from a family of 4 siblings. I'm one of 4. I'm the oldest. And all of us were college educated. At least 3 of us went beyond college. Of course, I went to law school late. My middle sister, Amy, has a PhD in economics, and the third daughter has a graduate degree, but not quite a doctorate in education. And they worked in their fields for quite a while. My brother is educated as an engineer, but then proceeded to work on Wall Street. Indeed, was one of the escapees from one of the towers at the World Trade Center on 9/11. There's lots of little points to talk about, but he's now retired. Everyone's retired, but I'm only semi-retired. So that brings you sort of close to where you may want to be at this point in terms of my family.
Well, actually, I want to go back a little bit.
Oh, please.
And ask how your parents met and where they met.
They met in Bridgeport, as I recall the story. And it was just a question of the families not putting them together. This was not a marriage that the families oriented or managed, if you will. But it was just a question of Italian Americans getting together in places where other Italian Americans were, probably other family members. And by 1939, they had known each other well enough that they married, and I was born in 1940.
And so where did they settle?
They settled in Newark, New Jersey. My father's, he went to high school there. He got an equivalent of a GED at the time. I don't know what they called that. But where he was working to learn his skills was in the Newark area. You know, Newark had an industrial side that people probably think still, that the industrial side that now people are familiar with was the Newark of the 30s and 40s and 50s even. It's not so. It was a beautiful city, absolutely gorgeous. And so there are wonderful, interesting residential areas. I grew up in a neighborhood in Newark that was not ghettoized in the real sense of the term because it was very, very mixed. It wasn't just a whole bunch of Italian Americans, but there were plenty of Italian Americans all around the city and in the adjoining states, so that there was a lot of interchange. And that's how they met. My mother's family was in Bridgeport. I think it was two brothers and she. Yeah, that's where it was. I'm thinking back now, did I miss a brother in there? So they got back and forth, and they married and stayed in Newark until I was 5. And by that time, my father found a property in an adjoining suburban town, which was also an interesting place to grow up at that time. And they built this factory, or they took over one. I'm not sure if they built it, but because I don't know enough about what happened at that point. I was 5. So we went to Irvington, a town of about 60,000 people, adjoining Newark, in the 45, 46 time frame. And I stayed there until I went to college. Of course, my parents stayed there for a long time. So I grew up in Irvington, town of 60,000 people, of great diversity. I always said that. The only group that really wasn't well represented in Irvington was the Black community. We had one Chinese family, and we had everyone of probably every other, let's say, religious background and ethnic background. So I grew up with a very large, diverse group.
So tell me a little bit about growing up in Irvington. You said about 5 years old
I was 5.
When your family moved there. And so do you remember going to elementary school?
I do. I have quite a few of that one because there was a really important event. Maybe I was closer to 6. But the event was that I think my mother took me to kindergarten when I started kindergarten in Newark. But what I remember about being in Irvington, she must have shown me where the school was, but I remember walking to school on the first day of school by myself. Well, in those days, children were allowed to go places reasonably by themselves, and that continued throughout my early childhood, middle childhood, and teenage years, I could get on a bus and go to New York if I wanted to, and my mother didn't know. But it was safe. So I started walking down the street to find the grammar school, Chancellor Avenue School, which is maybe 2.5, 3 blocks away. You had to cross a major street. I mean, in other words, there were buses running on one street, but most of it was residential, beautiful residential. And I was beginning to feel really uneasy when I got to one of the corners because I didn't recognize really whether this was the correct route. And I'm looking around. I remember there was a lilac bush on my right that wasn't in bloom, but I saw it bloom many times after. And all of a sudden I heard somebody behind me say, "Are you going to school?" And I turned around, and it was a child of my age, basically walking with another. And she said, and I said, "Yeah, I'm going." She said, "Would you like to walk with us?" And of course, I said yes. And that was my introduction to Irvington. Very welcoming, very supportive.
When you went to elementary school, did you have a favorite subject?
I think it probably was reading. I remember the first reaction I had in the first grade, because I don't think I could read before the first grade. I'm not sure. I don't think so. But when I recognized that Jill was the word Jill for the first time, it was such an enlightenment. It was so interesting. I don't remember, no, I'm sure I didn't, because I don't think I would have had that reaction. I think those were different times. Now also, my parents were not English-speaking people. They came here rather young with only Italian in their background. My mother didn't go beyond the 8th grade, and my father not much more. So I heard Italian spoken in the home, but I was not allowed to speak Italian. We were only allowed to speak English, which worked out fine. And I think related to the reading issue, I remember spelling as a favorite topic. My mother would spend, I don't know how long, but it was frequent times drilling me on spelling. So that's what I remember. I think it was very word-oriented in terms of my interest. As time went on, apparently I also liked math a lot, because when I finally finished high school, other than my interest in languages generally, I thought I was going to be a physics major in college. That's a story for another time. So I came from a family of immigrants, a family that did not speak English, but who were making their own way through the culture. I was particularly proud of my mother because she was at home. She wasn't necessarily out in the community, but she never shrunk from joining whatever there was to join. She rolled bandages at the hospital, at Irvington General Hospital. She agreed to be a Brownie leader and a Girl Scout leader, and this is with language that was limited. Of course, she was a very smart woman, so it didn't matter if she couldn't speak the language well. And over time, of course, we always had English newspapers coming in the house, and I know we had books, but compared to the way my children were exposed to reading and books, and my grandchildren, I feel like it was somewhat limited. A lot of fairy tales is what I do remember. My mother telling me them.
Did you have a favorite fairy tale?
Cinderella, of course.
Why was that your favorite?
Well, it's about, I guess it's about being, about moving from a status that was not terribly prized or wonderful to something really glorious. And perhaps it paralleled where I was with my family. I think we started rather poor. I don't mean dirt poor by any means, and we had always had enough food. My father always worked. I mean, there wasn't that kind of issue. But moving up from basically coming to this country with nothing and then evolving into what happened, because it was a business that put a lot of kids through college, not just in my family, and I'm probably still putting some kids through college. You know, it was really amazing. But I also remember that because my parents were they were immigrants and not English speaking, and I did not know the culture, I have to tell you. Who's to translate the culture? Your parents translate the culture. So I was picking it up somewhat piecemeal. And I also was their mediator in the sense that I mediated from the American culture to them, and I had to deal with the Italian culture that was coming at me as well. It was good. I grew up with opera in the house and with art. You know, my mother, having an 8th grade education, had some other education. I don't know where it emanated from, I don't know how, but she had all these interests. And I grew up learning the piano from 8 or 9 years old on, seriously learning. I mean, my mother thought if we were going to play the piano, we were supposed to have a serious teacher, and we did. So serious that we had to practice 2 hours a day, my sister Amy and I, and we did. And not only did we go learn to play, our teacher thought we needed to know about music theory, just in case we wanted to compose, you know, or really understand. So Friday nights were spent at the music school, learning music theory. The days were spent practicing piano, 2 hours. I pretty much put in 2 hours. You know, you could cheat a little bit, but I put in 2 hours because my teacher would not allow me to do otherwise in the end. And then we did some concerts, and you know what kids do. They have recitals, and in the Newark area, there was a type of, I wouldn't call it a competition, but all piano students took part in a, I don't know what to call it, but you had to prepare music, usually three pieces, and you had to play them in front of a skilled pianist, skilled musician. There were many, you're talking hundreds, and you were evaluated. You got graded, and certain grades entitled you to certain plaques that everybody got at probably the end of the school year. We all had this huge meeting, conclave, in one of the theaters in Newark, and we got called up to get our plaque for having done reached a certain level. And I did that for a long time.
Now, did your family own a piano?
Yes, my mother, that piano is still in the family. That piano went to my grandchild who lives in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. Pianos were very important in the family, even in my husband's family. We have his piano in the house. It was a piano that he bought with his money, the money that he earned, he says, starting at 9 years old, which is probably true, selling ice cream in New Haven, Connecticut at the games, you know, the college football games. So he used it to buy the piano. He said he bought it for his mother. I mean, he played the piano too. I thought that was really sweet. So we have that piano in our home, and we have an antique piano that my sister Amy, who's the real pianist in the family, had used for a long time when, as an adult, she decided, I mean, after college, after master's and doctorate degrees, decided to start piano again. She had this piano, and then decided she needed a really good one. And I took her antique piano, and she got the really good one. It's in my house. We like pianos.
Now, the piano school, this was an after-school program?
Yes. Yep.
And what was your favorite composer then?
Well, this would have to have been much later, and then when I got to the point of really understanding music. I think the first name that came into my head was Debussy in French, I guess. But I did a lot of work with Bach and Bach-like music. So much of the skill learning is music that exercises the hands and teaches the correct position at the piano and all that kind of thing. But Debussy and Chopin, I would say, were my favorite. They're very romantic. The musics are beautiful. I mean, the musical lines, the melody lines, if you want to call it melody, are absolutely beautiful. Bach, I think, relates to my interest in math. Mm-hmm. And it's structured. I still, to this day, I think I have an enormous interest in Bach, and there's a structure in it that is not linear, of course. I don't know if who knows about Bach, but it's complicated, and your brain, maybe it's like learning a second language. Your brain has to be able to juxtapose things that don't necessarily mesh rhythmically or otherwise. Very interesting music, not easy.
Now, you had indicated that your parents did not want you to speak Italian in the home.
Yes.
And so I would assume then that they were speaking Italian from time to time. Does that mean that you understood what they were saying?
Yes, I understood the dialect. That's why I think when I finally started learning French, I was doing so well in it, because I had already learned it, in a sense. Now, the pronunciation is quite different, but I could understand a lot of what I was learning in the classroom. And my parents spoke it not necessarily with each other, except those times when they didn't want us to follow what they were saying. But we spent every Friday night until I had to go to music school, sometime on the weekend with my grandparents who were living in Newark still. And they all spoke Italian. So the four of them would be in the kitchen, and they'd all be speaking this dialect, and the kids would be somewhere else. Interestingly, when the cousins were all there, somewhere else, there are only two places. One, we were watching the boxing matches, which was kind of strange for children. But mostly, we were in this little office that was to the far side of this three-story building in Newark where we had lived once, because we wanted to look at the medical books that my uncle Leonard had left behind. That's one of the four boys. I didn't tell you about the other boys, but so we would read these treatises on medicine, and we were all young. I mean, that's what we thought was so fascinating. We liked learning about medicine in there. Or we were watching boxing, or we were listening to the Italian and having cookies and stuff like that. But the other boys, my father helped get that factory started and worked there till he was 65, when, to his regret, he retired. He never stopped telling me how much he hated retiring. The second boy, Vito, was part of that. So those two ran the factory. My grandfather, their father, also was in there periodically, quite a bit actually, when he was young. But the next brother was sent to medical school with the funds that this family was making in this factory. And the fourth brother was sent to engineering school. So he's an engineer, went to Newark College of Engineering. And that brother then joined, after he came home from World War II, joined the boys in the factory. And he was their salesperson. He was their face to the rest of the community, because my father's English was pretty good by then. My Uncle Vito's was very good by then. But John had grown up in the culture, because he probably was, let's see, my father was 15, 13, 11, 9. So you see, he had grown up in the American, so he was the salesperson. He met with the vendors of steel, or the purchasers of the little things that they were making out of steel. That's what happened to that family there. Mm-hmm. I'm not sure how I got diverted to it, but we spoke Italian. They spoke Italian. I did not speak Italian, and neither did anybody else who was of that generation. We all spoke English, and my parents and I and my siblings spoke English to each other.
Did your parents ever say why they didn't want you to speak Italian?
They let's see, maybe not expressly. I inferred it. I never questioned it. I think we all accepted the unstated view that they were there to become American citizens, which they were, I think, even probably before I was born. I should get some of these dates straight. But they were there to establish a family in the United States, and they were bringing up children to be basically American, but not without introducing Italian values and visions and perspectives as well. There were clashes of culture from time to time, as you can imagine, but they mostly had to do with social things. When it came to the American emphasis on education, big time emphasis was their emphasis, and the work ethic, and you know, how you behave in community, the rules, the law, you know, the adoption of the, what I call the American ethic on all those issues, ethics and morality as well. There was no clash, really, that I can remember. I think if anywhere it came in what happens to a woman, a girl in that home. You know, I wanted to date early from their perspective. From my perspective, it wasn't early at all. And,
how old were you?
Well, I think probably around 15. I'm sure we had parties and things of that sort, but not dating. And I think around 15, the real idea of dating in the 50s was a young man asks you out and you go out somewhere, right? And of course, when they were able to drive, I mean, I guess it might have been, no, I guess we weren't driving till 18. So, but anyhow, my father was particularly distressed, and my mother was trying to keep the peace. So it was complicated, but it went to things like, well, you know, you can't wear nylons with the seam up the back. No, you can't have makeup, you know, that kind of thing. So it was complicated, and I was trying to explain this to them, why it was important. I think the most, there are a lot of things I could probably get into, but I think the most interesting one was, because I don't think I ever really felt comfortable in the culture, I don't think and I think to this day, I feel that there were some things that I just wasn't totally, I was maybe aware but not totally into growing up. You know, I think there were big pieces of the culture I didn't quite get all right away. But when I was in high school, I felt very much uncomfortable because I had to explain my parents who didn't speak English. At one point, I even had to explain how we ate, because we ate a different diet. You know, once in a while that would come up, and I had explained the fact that they wouldn't let me date. Everybody else was dating, you know what I mean? I had all these things. So when I got to high school, in grammar school it wasn't so bad. You know, I had a lot of friends, and you know, including the young little girl that asked me to if I wanted to walk. I thought that was very, very sensitive of her. She came to my our 50th wedding anniversary this year, which was we held it in June. It wasn't, our anniversary is December, but we went to New Jersey to have a bigger party with folks we know. She's still in my life, in other words. She was in life throughout all of that period. But in high school, I perceived that there was one avenue that might be open to me to become one of them, right? Whatever that meant, for girls. I mean, because girls didn't have a lot of avenues to go to. I don't know whether it was a leadership issue for me or just being defined as, yeah, she's okay, you know. And that was becoming a cheerleader. So that was my goal at age 15. And there was a whole route to that. You couldn't even try out till you were 16. No, 15, end of the year, 15, all through the year of being 15, and at the end of the year the decision was made. And so I practiced cheerleading in my living room when I didn't have to practice piano.
So how did your parents feel about those choices that you were making?
They were puzzled, I think. But you know, there were some choices that I made that were even harder for them to accept. On the cheerleading thing, I had to quit piano because I couldn't eventually go to the music school, as I call it, on Friday nights, because basketball in the spring of my 16th year was, basketball practice was on Friday night. So that was hard on my mother, but Amy kept playing the piano, so she was okay. She kept the tradition alive. But there were other issues that were very hard on them. But But I think what I have to say about all of that, mostly to their credit, they never prevented me. They never said no. They never locked me in my room and said, no, you're not going to try out for to be a cheerleader, because I made it. I made it, and I was captain in the senior year. I think I fudged it. I probably fudged it in the first year I was. I think I continued with piano. It was in my senior year when I quit.
What made you want cheerleading more than music?
Music had nothing to do with my being in high school. That was personal, and although actually that's not exactly right. But the kind of music I was learning had less to do with high school than being a cheerleader. I mean, nobody was defined in terms of playing classical music in my high school in 1954. However, I did play the piano because I was then picked to accompany kids who were singing in high school. So, you know, that got to be quite an interesting entree as well, because it got me into yet a different group. You know, singers are always, as always, they were really popular. And they were in a different category than just about everybody, other than the cheerleaders and the flag swingers and the majorettes. This was the group.
So you were very interested in creating a social life for yourself in high school.
Yes, yes.
What was the name of the high school you attended?
Irvington High School.
And did you have any favorite subjects?
Well, I was very interested in languages. I studied Latin and French, and I took all the math courses that were offered. I think that was, and English. I was writing poetry by that time, so I clearly had an interest in English. I can only answer that question by what I did. I don't remember being impassioned, saying, "Oh God, I love this class in calculus," or something like that. But that's what I studied, and all of that. And on top of that, I was writing quite a bit. I still have some of that poetry because it was published in the senior class magazine and the junior class, you know.
What was the focus of your poetry?
Oh gosh.
In general?
Probably teenage, issues like, I don't know, losses or joys or, the usual kinds of things. I have to look it up. They were very imagistic. I mean, I'm not sure the content was important to me as it was more a way of putting words together again. Because as I read them, a few of them now, even the ones I wrote later, I don't think they have as much meaning in terms of content. They were a way of putting words together in a creative way. Mm-hmm. So that the words, it'd be like doing a painting. So the two colors together might not make any difference to you or me, and the words together may not make any difference to anyone who was reading it, but they were published. And that's what I was interested in doing, basically.
So did you have any teachers who really framed your perspective even about poetry or any other subject?
Yes, I did, actually, other than the teacher in my first grade who taught me how to read, who taught me about the word. Reading is so interesting because it wasn't that I was reading, it was understanding that the enlightenment, that these characters had meaning. I thought that was, and I didn't need anyone to teach me after that. That's what was so amazing. Well, the teacher in high school, I think, without question, I'm going through all the teachers in my mind now, was my cheerleading coach, because she was an English major and a phys ed major. And she studied every summer at Bread Loaf with Robert Frost and was writing extensively. But she was my cheerleading coach as well. So, yeah, she gave me probably the idea that an interesting life was more than one choice that one might make, and that maybe combining things might be a way to go. But certainly the fact that she was a writer probably meant something to me. I find that really phenomenal. Even to this day, I think I remember feeling, wow, this is really interesting because she was teaching phys ed and she was my cheerleading coach. And somehow, being a phys ed teacher, and it didn't seem to go with the poetic part. And I thought that was just fascinating.
Do you remember her name?
Absolutely, Sunny Utterback.
And did she publish anything?
She did publish. I don't know that I remember, I'm not sure that it was published widely. I don't remember exactly where, but yes. I think it took the form, the writing took the form ultimately with what she did in a Christmas letter that she sent out every year, which was highly poetic. I still have many of them, that she would communicate with her friends. That's really what I remember afterwards with her writing skills.
Now, when did you decide that you wanted to go to college after high school?
Oh, that was always in the mix. It was just a given. I think it goes back to my mother predominantly. My father found this all very unusual, but he didn't say no. My mother said, I think the kids should go to college, or wherever she said, or they should be in scouting, or whatever she was saying. He just agreed with it. That was the role that she had, and he respected it. But it was just a given, and probably my mother talked about it. For one thing, she had a niece who was still in Italy, and who's still in Italy, in her 80s at this point, but she had a niece who had been educated and who was a teacher in this village environment, this rural environment. And she always talked about it as though it was the highest status one could have, period. Naturally, you probably can guess, that's what I was supposed to do. It had to do with becoming a teacher. And of course, you had to go to college to become a teacher. You see the nexus there, I'm sure.
Did she ever directly talk with you about it, or just highlight this niece?
I know we had discussions about being a teacher, no question. And because it just followed, well, if you're going to be a teacher, you have to go to college. It just was always part of the mix. There was never any question about it.
Was that something that you really felt passionate about, or you just decided to follow that course?
College or teaching?
Teaching.
I don't know that I ever felt passionate about it. I don't know what I felt passionate about, actually. I wasn't quite sure, except in high school, I clearly wanted to study in France. That I was passionate about.
Why is that?
Don't know. I have no idea. But I really don't. I was just called not only to study in France, I felt called to study in Paris. And maybe it was the kind of literature. I can't put my finger on it. Of course, I wanted to perfect my knowledge of French, and there's no question. And I think it follows in a way from that if you're going to perfect something, you go where you can perfect it. If you want to perfect your abilities in, say, engineering or, tech stuff, maybe you go to MIT or something else. But I wanted to perfect my knowledge of French. And so the epitome, to me, of where you do that was, of course, you go to the Sorbonne. And that's why I went to the college I chose.
But you were raised in an Italian family,
right.
so
it was my father's family. Oh, didn't mean to step on.
No. So
no,
tell
my
me.
father's family is from 13th century, is partly French. I didn't tell you that because maybe you thought as much when I gave you the maiden name, Petiti. That there's some French somewhere in that background. Yes, the family is culturally significantly Italian, but I think the French culture is pervasive if you're interested in art, music. You can't get away from it too far, and I'm not sure why else. What could have been generating this interest, but I knew I wanted to be at the Sorbonne, period.
And how long had you been learning French as a language?
I started in high school.
In high school.
And we didn't have grammar school French then.
And did you have a favorite French teacher, or was it the same person?
My French teachers really did stand out in high school. It was so grammar oriented. It wasn't a really fascinating topic, except just like everything else, like learning the spelling words sitting at the kitchen table. I just like words. So, you know, that part was interesting, but it didn't become really fascinating until college, certainly, in the literature classes. And then again in France, where there was a big immersion into what French is really all about, particularly literature and the culture, and then at Yale. So, because I went on to started a doctorate degree in French literature and ended up with a master's because I decided I couldn't use the doctorate in where I was headed, which was not teaching.
Now, when you were in high school, tell me about the thoughts that you had about which college you wanted to go to, or was there just simply one place you wanted to go?
Well, there was one place. I had applied to several colleges, but because I wanted to go to Paris and study at the Sorbonne, that really came down to pretty much one college. I may have missed one or two. This was in 1957 when I was looking, but I don't think so. There were colleges that had junior year abroad programs in France, but I had only found Elmira College had a program where they would be able to get me into the Sorbonne, because most of the colleges had an arrangement where they would find a place somewhere in the city and have good professors and teachers, you know, teaching, but I needed to see the whole thing. I mean, I needed to be there. And not only was I able to get, I could get instruction teaching at the Sorbonne, there were other classes available to me through my college, through the relationships that they had built up. I'm not sure, it had to do with one of the professors, I'm sure. But I also was able to go to the Louvre, for example, and I learned the history of art there as well. So I was combining a lot of things. I was studying sociology at the Sorbonne, and that's what I was doing. And that I wasn't just there, I should take that back. I don't mean just, because I was also studying literature. But my interests were quite wide for someone who's trying to speak a different language. And therefore, I had to be in an academic environment where I could learn sociology. I thought I was going to go into social work, I guess. I don't know where I was going. So that's why I went to Elmira. Now, I applied to other schools because I had no assurance of getting into that college, but I did.
How many years did you spend at the Sorbonne?
One, junior year. Mm-hmm.
And that made you want to do more, obviously.
Yes, I could have. I know you think you're thinking about doing more in French. I wanted to stay more at the Sorbonne. I wanted to stay longer there, but I couldn't. I had to come back to get my degree, which was an interesting senior year, but I did come back.
What was the reason you wanted to also major in sociology?
Well, I thought my exposure to that area of knowledge was enlightening. I started in college, I'm sure, no question, and I think I may have started with a course in anthropology, social anthropology and cultural anthropology and physical. I know I didn't take sociology in my freshman year. I think I took an anthropology course, and it was more than enlightening. I mean, I began to see things quite differently than I had there to that point in time.
Explain that.
Well, the whole theory of how societies form, groups form, societies form, the physical evolution of humanity, of animals and humanity, all of that was so amazing to me, and probably had some influence on shaking up some of my religious beliefs. I mean, all of that, that's what happens in college. It was very revolutionary. And so at some point I do remember thinking, well, I don't think I want to be an anthropologist, but I maybe do want to, but that didn't seem like a viable career to me for some reason. So I translated that into sociology. And indeed, I was combining a lot of different areas of study because Elmira had a way of a curriculum. They were very flexible, and we could put together things if we could justify it. So I was putting together probably by my sophomore year, sociology and psychology, because it put together all the things that I had become very interested in, which is what affects human behavior. It's either in groups, so, socially, in societies, how do they build them, or it's personally. So I had ended up with this incredible mosaic, I guess, with all the right credits, all enough credits, because I'd been studying in France and picked up a lot just on French alone, of majors in sociology and sociology/psychology and French. And on top of that, I should add that I took a summer at the State College in New Jersey, Montclair, and got enough credits to have an education certificate, I guess, so I could teach, because I guess I thought I was going to have to teach at some point. It sounds like I don't want to teach. I still teach, but so I did all of that.
Do you think that events transpiring in America at that time influenced perhaps your interests in sociology, psychology, and the behavior of groups?
Probably. Yes. I remember, in college, you mean?
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm. Oh, absolutely, in college. I remember being invited, as everyone in Elmira College was invited, to march down the main street in Elmira, New York, a small, beautiful Victorian town in upstate New York, but fairly inward, quiet, march down the main street in sympathy with the Woolworth sit-ins. So I remember I and, of course, my other friends and others in Elmira College were put to the test. So I thought, well, yeah, I think this is exactly what I want to do. And I remember it so well because we had some rules that we had to follow, which went to something like this. You have to all be in white. That's what I remember. I think we were all dressed in white. We probably had white heels on because that's the way you dressed then. And there's not going to be any noise or talking. We're just going to march down the street. I guess we must have made it clear why we were there. And we all were worried that we were going to get kicked out of college, every one of us. So we didn't. And that idea of making change carried on a bit in a couple of ways. First of all, when I got back from France, I had already learned quite a bit from the French on how you protest. I couldn't do the protesting because I was there on a French government scholarship, but I could watch them. And it was interesting on what students thought they could make changes and what non-students did. I mean, French is known for its strikes and everything else, and when they want change, they make it somehow. I think the one that I thought was the most interesting was when they changed I think they changed the price of the school lunch. And it was very little money. To me, it was like a quarter. And the French thought it was students thought it was outrageous, and they just. But when we had a problem with our president, Elmira, in senior year, what did we do? We had a sit-in the gym, and it was a big one. I mean, a lot of students participated. The march down the street in Elmira was small, probably not more than 20 people. So I learned all of that, and I learned about law and rules and what happens if you think you want to challenge it, and why should you do it, and how you should do it. All of that. I learned, for example, that if you're going to lose your French government scholarship, you don't get out and march in the street with the French kids that you like. I mean, you had to make choices on how you're going to protest, I think. That's what was going on.
So by the time you got to your senior year, what decisions did you make about after?
Well, I think in my senior year, for sure, I wasn't clear about what I was going to do after. So I took the lifeline that my mother had suggested, and I decided to teach because I needed some time to figure it out. And that's what I did. I started teaching in a program that was, again, on the, on the frontier. French in the elementary schools, or any language in the elementary schools, was almost unheard of. But I found a little school in New Jersey, a little town in New Jersey that had the money to start the program. So I was hired to teach French in the elementary schools, 3rd grade. That's what I did.
What town?
Ramsey, New Jersey. And I lived close by, started commuting. It was about a half an hour, but it was like commuting from here, to Washington. And I didn't like having to commute in the morning. So I found someone who had a room in her very large, beautiful home because her mother was living elsewhere. And she was working in New York. And so I moved there and taught during the week and went home on the weekends. But in the meanwhile, I was, I wonder if I should go on in sociology, or I wonder if I should go on in French or whatever. So that year I started doing more work in a graduate level in sociology for 2 reasons. I was interested, and secondly, I was curious about a school in New York City called the New School for Social Research, which is renowned for a lot of things, mostly on social issues. And really fascinating professors, really high-level, interesting professors. And I wanted to see what it would be like to go to school in New York City a bit. So I did that and learned sociology and, criminology. Took a class of criminology and social research in case I went on in sociology. And
What year was this?
1963.
And now, what really attracted you to that school? Because there were many different schools in New York City. So what specifically about that school?
Its reputation and its location in Greenwich Village. And I just thought it would be a different kind of environment than I had been ensconced in, other than Paris, I guess. And and they had a night division. So I could drive in from Ramsey easily to New York, park my car, go to class. I'm not sure I even examined anything else. I don't think anyone else had quite that kind of accessibility at night in terms of what they were offering. But at the same time, by the way, I applied to NYU in their School of Social Work, and I was accepted. And I applied to Yale in their French department and was accepted in the doctoral program. That very year, that's what I was doing. Because I wasn't sure exactly what I wanted to do. So I thought, well, I'll just keep up with this for now. This will sound like a good idea to me. So I went to Yale.
What made you decide to go to Yale?
Well, how can you say no to Yale? How can you say no to Paris? You can see the thread already.
Right.
I was interested in French literature. It wasn't that I didn't want to pursue it. I just didn't think, I wasn't sure I wanted to teach in the elementary school. That I knew. The kids are fun, but, I had a grand time. But you can't discuss anything of any substance with them in 3rd grade. So the other problem was the cost of going to the School of Social Work and the fact that I'd have to get probably an additional graduate degree to really do anything significant in social work, that I thought, oh gosh, it's just, I'm not sure. And lots of people had talked to me about the fact that the jobs were really low paying, and I was concerned about it. And I'm not sure I got a scholarship to go to NYU. I may have. I don't remember, but I knew I did have a fellowship at Yale. So those were the factors.
Mm-hmm. So you entered Yale,
Mm-hmm.
and what was the first year like for you?
Hard. It was interesting. Well, again, there's so many interesting, enlightening things that happened every time I made a decision that I didn't expect. And I'm not putting this in any particular order, but gee, that was quite a year. So let me talk about it academically. It was really rigorous, and I had already had quite a bit of work. I could work with the language, thankfully. But for example, I decided to take a course in a French philosopher. I'm not sure it was because I wanted to, maybe I had to, or maybe it was the only thing offered when I was looking at it, by the name of Diderot, Diderot. Interesting guy, interesting philosopher who's written some very interesting things. But in Yale, if you're going to take a course in anybody, you had to read the whole body of work. Now, Monsieur Diderot wrote an encyclopedia, and we had to read everything. So that's the way it was. Mm-hmm. And it was a very rigorous training, and I did fine. And well, I'll get back to that just in a minute. But on top of that, I met the man who was going to be my husband. I didn't know, we met before we even started class, because the professor who was the head of the department and probably was at that time nationally and internationally known as a professor of French and French literature, Henri Père, thought it would be kind of fun to put together the comparative literature first-year students and the French first-year students. We were all graduate students. And so he put together a little social gathering, and I met Joe, and he was in comparative literature, and we spoke French. He's perfectly fluent in French, and we started, dating, well, mostly just practicing French and studying a lot. But we ended up then becoming engaged, I guess, at the end of that year and married. The other thing that happened that year that was pretty shocking, to put it mildly, this was, all this was going on, and we had an assassination in the country. No, that wasn't that year. Hold on. Yes, we did.
63.
It was that year, of course. I don't know why I suddenly blanked on that. I guess I was mixing it up with some other pretty startling things, but not that year. Yes, John F. Kennedy. You know what I was mixing it up with? I was out of the country when he was elected. Oh. That's what's sticking in my mind. And I can't remember if I got to vote. Isn't that interesting? But anyway, 60, when I was there in graduate school, 61, it was November, wasn't it? So it had to be 63, right, when we just got there. And Joe and I were studying. I forgot, we went to one of the beautiful parks in the New Haven area. I remember studying pretty intensely and having these very interesting conversations about, I don't know, poetry. He might have brought a poem with him. I don't remember. It was, one of those things that literature majors do. And we were out in the afternoon, pretty much, just talking and we got back. I got back to my dormitory, and I kind of bounced into the room. I was sharing it with someone who was in epidemiology, very interesting woman. And I'm bouncing in thinking, well, did you have a good day? And I had a great day. And she looked at me as though I had lost my mind and left. She just left. She didn't say anything. I thought, this is kind of strange, and because we hadn't heard. Yeah, it was pretty shocking. Yeah, very shocking. The other thing I did while I was at Yale that all these have some sort of nexus. There are threads. But I always had dinner at the law school. I had no idea that I wanted to be a lawyer. I never did want to be a lawyer. It never occurred to me that I might be a lawyer or want to be a lawyer. I'm a literature major, really. Law, after all, pretty dry. But I had lunch, usually dinner, sometimes lunch at the law school because it had the best dinner. And I met people studying to be lawyers, and it looked pretty okay, but not as interesting as French literature. I never thought it again until much later.
So what happened after your first year? You were set to continue on with the PhD program.
Well, then I realized that I didn't want to teach even at the college level. I didn't want to teach.
Why is that?
I'm not sure. I don't know. I think it felt as though it wouldn't, perhaps the better way to explain it, because I think it might be more accurate, is I have a very wide span of interests, really wide. And I think I was having a hard time confining myself both to French literature and to teaching. But, you know, the teaching of of any subject, not just French literature, to me was had the sense, I must have felt confined in some way. And I think all that I've done since supports that analysis, if I have to analyze myself. I don't think I'm very happy in a circumstance where I have to limit myself to one or two things. And I think that had a big role in why I said, no, I don't want to teach. I guess I envisioned myself in a classroom, you know, day in and day out with this one subject. It probably would have been much more interesting because I have friends who teach, some who are just superb teachers, professors really, at very high levels. Judith Resnick at Yale, for example, you might run across her name. I mean, what a life she has, what a wonderful life. And interesting, and the interchange with her colleagues and with the students. I mean, that would have filled in a lot of what I thought I needed, but I'd never got that far because I was on a I was on a fellowship at Yale, and there were only, this is a class of 25 people, right, in the class. I'm not sure they were all on fellowship, but I knew this, somebody was going to need that fellowship who really wanted to teach, and I thought, I just can't do it. I can't keep going because I don't want to do that. And that's what they wanted. They wanted us to be professors of French ultimately, I'm sure, and that's what most of them did, those who stuck it out. So I left. I told them I didn't want to continue. I knew that informally, if you went to your head of your department or whomever, I know it wasn't Henri Père, it was somebody in a secondary position, and asked if they would consider giving me a master's since I wanted to leave, that they probably would say yes. So I did, because I was determined at least to have something, you know. So I did, and he said yes if you write a thesis. So I wrote a thesis that probably would have been good for a doctoral thesis. I wrote it anyway.
What was the topic?
It was a literary analysis of Stendhal's novel, The Red and the Black. I don't think I have a copy of it. I wish I did. I wish I remembered what I did, what I said.
I'm sure Yale has a copy of that.
I don't know. You know, maybe I should go find it. So I did it. It took me the end of the, I think it took me until, gosh, 66 maybe. I don't remember when I finally finished it, because by that time I had married, and Joe and I moved to Alabama, Montgomery, right after the Selma March. So you can see this is all beginning to tie up. We didn't go because we wanted to go to Montgomery. We went because Joe decided it might be interesting to do some work in a different forum than, say, a college. He had looked at that too, and he was working on finishing his doctorate degree. He has a doctorate in French literature from Sorbonne, but he wanted to finish the one in comparative literature. So something opened up at Air University where he could teach some French, but he could also do some analysis of the Vietnam War or whatever else policy-related issues that they had. Air University is the graduate school for the Air Force. So it was in Montgomery. So he said, you know, I think we should go try that. It's kind of interesting. It's a little different. It's not taking a college position. So we did.
So now what year did you and Joe get married?
It was 1964 in December, just before Christmas, December 19. And
you finished up at least the coursework of your program
that was completed
that year. And
yes.
Then you all moved to Selma, you said, or Montgomery?
Well, actually, first Joe was finishing up his coursework, so I taught another year in Greenwich, Connecticut, in their elementary school program, which was really well developed. They were way in the forefront, Greenwich and Ramsey and a few other school systems in that area. So I taught in the elementary school, and then we moved, yeah.
Were you teaching French in the
yes,
elementary?
I was teaching. I had 3rd, 5th, and 6th, I think, by that time, because they had been teaching for a while. I think it was 3rd, 5th, and 6th. It was more than 3rd.
And so you and Joe moved down to Alabama.
Montgomery,
Alabama.
Alabama.
And And what were you doing while he was teaching?
Well, I started by looking for a job because I wanted to, we didn't have children. We had just married, essentially. And I couldn't find a teaching job, which was so interesting because I was proficient in French, but I couldn't find one. And so that put me, at the sort of the mercy of what might be available. But I thought, well, how shall I present myself, since I have a degree in French literature? I don't have any French teaching jobs. And I remembered that, and not that it was hard to remember, I had always written for my school papers, journals, books, whatever. I had done a lot of that. And I had also been a broadcaster on the Elmira College radio station. I had had a music program, a classical music program, which entailed introducing the piece of music that the engineer would play. And so I thought, well, let me go look at the newspaper and let me go look at the radio station. And believe it or not, they both wanted to hire me. And I went with the newspaper. I think I had more skills in writing than I did. I didn't know how they were going to use me at the newspaper, at the radio. But also, I could see by just walking in the place that this was going to be interesting. How else can I put it? And it was. It was really interesting. This is a paper that was established before the Civil War even, and by the Civil War, it was a really important newspaper in the South. And then, as I didn't know all of this really, but this is a newspaper of tremendously interesting tradition. Among other things, by the 1900s, they were carrying on the fight against the Ku Klux Klan right there in Montgomery. You could see that there's something about the newsroom that was fascinating. First of all, maybe this was true for all newspapers at the time, but it was mostly male. But there were at least 3 women in that newsroom. 2 of them did the women's pages, and 1 had a beat. Right? This was in the 60s, and there were 3 people working on who were African American. The paper had what we called then, or they called then, the black page. So interesting to me, because this is a paper that when I got there in the 60s was pro-integration to the point that they were under bomb threat. Okay, so at least the editorial page writers who were. And I thought, well, this is kind of curious. They have an editorial policy in favor of integration, and they have a black page, and they have their 3 black newspaper people. I think it was 2 or 3. I have to explain why that is. Sitting there writing things that have nothing to do with the community as a whole. And it turned out, I went to the editor, read me, and said, well, why is this? I don't get it. Somewhat critically. And the point was that if the African Americans who were the writers felt that if they integrated the paper, there would be no longer any news about the black community in Montgomery. And the paper, accepted their view on it. That was fine. And I think that was the right thing to do, because their papers were all about the black community's social life, all the weddings, all the clubs, all the churches. And it was all in that couple pages worth, I think, as I remember. Probably 2. So it was an interesting experience for me. I had never, of course, had been in the South, never had been in the South. I came down from the North thinking the South was pretty monolithic. They were all segregationists, and we were going to have an interesting time because I knew where I was coming from, having marched in Elmira and, fought and talked and all that kind of about integration. It turned out not to be the case. It was not monolithic, and it wasn't just in the newspaper. It was in the community at large. And although I started on the women's pages with, my boss was Catherine Tyson, who was Helen Keller's niece. Interesting. I ended up with a beat, and my beat was education, which was interesting at the time, education in Montgomery.
Was that your choice?
No, Someone just gave it to me. And if I'd stayed there longer, it could have been really fascinating. But we left after almost 3 years. But the interesting thing that I did is we all had to write a feature story every single Sunday. So I really had to search around, and it wasn't that hard to find people of interest. I wrote about everybody. Montgomery had people coming in all the time. There were 2 Air Force bases, and there were some other cultural things that people would come in for. And the minute they were in town, I would grab them and I'd interview them. But I guess my prize interviewees were George Wallace and Lurleen. So that was
you have to tell me about that.
Yeah. Well, George Wallace was a real interesting character. I think even before I interviewed him, when my sisters came to visit us in Montgomery, we were walking around the Capitol and this and that, just the 3 of us. And one of the Capitol Police came up to us and said, "Would you like to meet the governor?" So naturally we said, yes, why wouldn't we? So he brings us in to meet George Wallace. And we sit down and we then listen. It must have been over an hour just listening to what the governor had to say about all kinds of things, about his governorship. I don't think we talked about the integration issue. I don't think we challenged him. I think we were just 3 nice young ladies, properly brought up, just listening because he wanted to talk to us, tell him all about what his views were and that. I don't think we talked about integration. It was such a shock to have had that happen. I didn't expect to be.
So there were just 3 of you in the room with the governor.
Yeah. Well, there probably was a captive policeman in there in case we were going to do something awful, which.
And you never understood or knew why
No.
he chose the 3 of you?
No, I have no idea. It was totally arbitrary, I'm sure. Well, maybe not so arbitrary. There must have been something behind that choice. Well, then Lurleen was running for governor when I finally got to deal with these kinds of issues. And I wanted to interview her for my feature page. So I called up, and I did, and he was right there on her shoulder, and she really was a lot more able than people gave her credit for, but he was there to make sure that nothing unusual would happen. I have the piece somewhere. I have a whole scrapbook of the feature stories that I wrote.
How do you think this experience changed the way you thought about things?
Oh, can't make assumptions and draw conclusions about anything. You better test it out. It was a surprise to me to meet Deep South, people from the Deep South, to learn some of their thinking was not as I had expected. Now, I didn't think they were monsters or evil people or anything like that, but I just expected that by and large we were not going to agree, at least on the issue of integration. There were other problems. There were problems having to do with religious biases. I, as a Catholic, and they rarely saw Italian Americans, really. I mean, there were a lot, and even the gender issue was bubbling itself up there quite a bit. But, so I knew there were social issues that we probably would disagree on. But I didn't expect entirely, I didn't expect the depth of bias that went beyond the African American community. I was really unaware, I guess, for some reason, that the Klan, because we did see some of this, of course, would run around with signs that said, probably something like, well, I don't know if they said kill, but they said something bad. They'd have the N-word, then the next one was Jews, and then the next one was Catholics. Now, I can tell you, I knew the N-word was going to be there. I guess I wasn't too surprised about the N-word, but I mean, about the Jews being there, but I was a little surprised. But I didn't know how they felt about Catholics. That's where I was in shock. Okay. The other part was how strong people in the South felt about the issue of they were pro-integration, and these were people who had to live there. I knew Joe and I were going to leave at some point. Our families were in the North. And I'm not sure we would ever really fit into the culture exactly, no matter how liberal some Southerners were. And they were very strong and courageous people. It didn't, they they walked down the street too. They walked over the bridge, you know. It was all of that. Of course, I understood that, but I didn't see the depth of it in terms of people who weren't necessarily walking across bridges, but who were just living there, you know. Fascinating, fascinating, fascinating. These curious, hard to understand, these are people who couldn't live, who really wanted to keep African Americans from drinking from their fountains. I could not get it. And yet they would eat the food that African Americans cooked. It was so unusual and curious to me. I had grown up with African Americans in my home, even though Irvington didn't have them. My mother had help in the house, and they were from Newark, and they were black. I mean, up until forever. I mean, we've never had any problem. You know, we had a lot of interchange in that capacity. And of course, my biggest exposure and the most treasured is the relationship that I've developed with people in the African American community, mostly through my work as a lawyer and a judge, and my 3-year, 4-year, 5-year stint as a gospel singer with a gospel group in Northern Virginia. It was we're so blessed to have the opportunity to really have a large group of diverse people to relate with. But anyway, I was not uncomfortable, you know, with eating their food. I couldn't get that where the Southerners were coming from. But that's just a cultural thing. I got that. But the fact that they were willing to fight it out on their own ground and stay there, take the blows, because it was a sacrifice, that was interesting to me. And as I said, it was not necessarily folks like John Lewis who are going to walk across. These were just regular old people who were just there doing the right thing. One last story, and I'll let this part go because it can go on and on. But because the New York performing arts people refused to come and give their concerts in Montgomery to a segregated audience, there were no major New York concerts originating in New York, you know, whether it was symphony or anything else, in Montgomery for quite a while. So someone had the idea. Now this is all taking place in 2.5 years, right? That's all. I'm there in just 2 months after the Selma March. Okay. Close to the time we were about ready to leave, so maybe 2 years into it, someone in Montgomery thought, we need to get our concert series back. So they put together a committee of Montgomeryans and me. By that time, I guess I had qualified. And they wanted to put together, they wanted us to get the concert series back. And we knew what we had to do. And believe it or not, I don't remember exactly how we did this, but we did. By the time we left in it had to be 67. By the time we came to Virginia in 67, I think it was the summer, because Joe had taken the job in the Pentagon, and I remember where we lived, so it had to be 67. I and African Americans and non-African Americans went to the first integrated concert series in Montgomery. Maybe ever. I didn't stop to look at the history, but probably ever. Now, can you believe that? So
And
that's what I
was-
learned. It was in their concert, their audit, you know, wherever they had them before. Mm-hmm. So I'm coming up to Virginia saying, well, it just is not so uniform, or, you know. And frankly, considering what happened after 1967, everywhere else in the country, I thought that was pretty remarkable. Maybe not everybody liked that fact that they had an integrated audience, but there were plenty of people who did in Montgomery, Alabama. So I thought that was interesting, and I think about it a lot. And I know things, well, I guess what it teaches you is you can work for change, and people of goodwill will change, and it just takes a little time and a little effort, and it can be done. And it will be done. I still believe that. That's probably why I went into the law, by the way.
And let's kind of move in that direction. Mm-hmm. So you and your husband moved up to Northern Virginia.
Yes.
He's working at the Pentagon.
Yes.
Doing what?
Well, he's still with the Air Force at that point. He was a civilian with the Air Force, so he took a position as a civilian with the Air Force there as well in the Department of Defense for the Secretary of the Air Force. Eventually, he was more associated with the Department of Defense than just the Air Force. And he's, you know, I wish I had his bio to tell you, because we were just looking at things like that. He did some fascinating things in that position, including at that time, and maybe still, the Department of Defense had desks that related to foreign countries. I remember when he had the Italian desk and we got invited to the White House when Jimmy Carter was the president, because it was Italian ambassador or president coming. It was so fascinating because we got to meet President Carter and Rosalind, his wife. There's a little story there, shall I tell it?
Yes.
Well, I'm jumping over what I really wanted to talk about. But so we get in the receiving line, and it was black ties, so I had a gown on that I had, I'm not sure, maybe I purchased it for it, but it was quite sort of a plain gown. It had sort of tiers. It was beige. So I thought, gee, this is the perfect gown for a gardenia. So we went out and bought a fresh gardenia, and I wore it sort of, you know, here, and right. It wasn't low cut, but there, not on my shoulder, in other words, because it didn't take it to have the shoulder. So I come up to meet President Carter, and I could tell immediately he could smell the gardenia, but he didn't know what it was, because I could see by the fact that he had to look down at the gardenia, you know. So he looked down, then he looked up, and he looked down. It was so amusing and fun, and he was smiling, and I greeted him as one should, and after I had met Rosalind, and we had a lovely night there, and it was just remarkable. And you know, it's another one of those things that who would have ever foretold? Would I have ever been able to say, well, maybe someday we're going to be in the White House meeting the president to honor the president of Italy, or I think it was the president, and I'm going to have a white gardenia on. Those things don't really happen. They only happen in storybooks.
What made you choose a gardenia?
I think I like gardenias. I like the way they smell, and it seems southern to me. I don't know if it's truly southern. It just seems southern to me. And I think magnolias would have been a better choice, but I probably couldn't get one. I do have a magnolia in my yard, though. So that was it. There was a Swedish desk that he also was posted to for a while. He did a lot of writing for a newspaper that comes out probably to this very day on issues that, from the president down to whomever, the secretary have to know about. So we did the Swedish desk. He's been everywhere in the world. That was interesting. He's actually taken off from a what do they call them? A ship. You know, where the planes come off from the ship. It's that kind of interesting thing. So I did that. When he did that, I did work in the community. That's your question, I think. What was I doing? I had 3 children. I had the first one born in '68, the next one 2 years, 18 months later, then the next one 4 years later, because in the intervening time, I had come to some conclusions about what I should be doing eventually. But I worked in the community. The first thing I did was join the League of Women. Well, the kids were small, so other than go to the library, and when Joe came home to work with the kids, I thought I didn't know very much about government, and I didn't. You know my background, I've just given it to you. I don't think I had a single political science course, ever. I probably knew more about French government than American government, because that's what you learn. So I joined the League of Women Voters to learn about how things worked in government and in the community. And on top of that, I did things like head up committees for the bond issues I think the first one was the schools, and I think I had one for the court, and just community stuff. And before I even went to law school, I was asked to sit on the Tenant-Landlord Commission. This is the kind of thing I would do. And I ended up chairing the Tenant-Landlord Commission. We put together their arbitration procedure for tenant-landlord disputes. I was starting to work on some things that looked like the law. we put an interjurisdictional committee together on legislation affecting tenant rights, that kind of thing.
Your involvement in these kinds of groups, was this because of your concern about social justice, or was it simply being in the right place at the right time?
Both. I have for someone who really likes to plan a lot and I don't like to leave anything to the last minute. I like to know where I'm going, how I'm going. I have the kind of history that is just peppered with things that I agreed to do that I never envisioned, never planned. And it goes back to the fact that I didn't feel I had to limit myself to anything because I had this wide interest. So I was interested in anything that involved human rights or civic rights or whatever. So when someone asked me to go on the Tenant-Landlord Commission, I thought, well, why not? I don't know a whole lot about it, but I'm sure there are things that of interest there, or the bond issue for the schools, or learning about government. Yeah, I had an opportunity that presented itself, and I took it, and I did that a lot.
And for how many years or months were you involved in this?
A long time on the Tenant-Landlord Commission. I think I'm not sure I quit when I started law school or not. I started law school in 1975. So I probably stayed on till just about that time. I stayed on as long as I could on a lot of things, but it turned out I couldn't do everything. I went to night division at Washington College of Law at American.
What made you make that decision? What prompted that decision?
I wanted to retool, is the way I put it. I wanted to be able to go back to work when my children were reasonably grown. And I didn't know what I could be hired for, to do that I would want to do. I could continue. Well, there were things I knew I had to get advanced degrees in, one of which was I could have gone on in sociology or psychology or both or something like that, or I could put that into the, say, local government. I could do local government, probably would have been hired somewhere, even without getting an advanced degree. I knew I wasn't going to teach French. I was sure I wasn't going to be a newspaper woman because I thought the job would be very hard to do with a family. I think that's correct. Besides, I would want to have been on the Washington Post, or, they weren't going to hire me then, probably. So I thought, that's probably not going to work out. So I began thinking about, I just did a analysis, that's how I did it. And I put down the things I was doing. I literally did. I said, well, what are you doing? What have you been doing? What do you think that means, that you like to write, And you're working on change in various ways or another, and...
Was this something that you normally did?
No, never.
Really? What prompted you to do it now?
I was, what's the word? I mean, I was sort of, I had no choice. If I was going to do something, I had to make a decision that was practical, but that had potential meaning. I mean, it had to be practical. I had practical things to do. I didn't want to do them, apparently. So the next step had to be practical. We had 2 children, and we were going to have a third, I think. I thought we would have a third. So I just couldn't go off, on a lark somewhere. It's going to take money if I were going to retool. So it had to have some practical aspect to it, but it had to have meaning. And the meaning part had to do with, well, look at what you've been doing. What is it that might, and I mean might, put it together? I never really was sure. The practical was, with 3 kids, I need to have enough money to pay for someone to take care of them, probably, But it was transferable. If we left Virginia, I would want to have something I could do somewhere else. That was the practical part, and that came out to be the law.
Now, you said you went to the night school program, which usually takes a little bit longer.
Right.
So did you stay in the night school program?
Yes. Well, Yes, predominantly. I think the last year, I went 3 years and 2 summers, by the way, so it was a little shorter. But I believe I did start doing some day division when my youngest, Christine, was in a days out program, Mother's Day Out. That's what it was called then. Boy, that seems like eons away. Mother's Day Out. I could sneak away to Washington College of Law, which was well located for what I had to do with the kids and everything else. And the 2 summers, the first summer I took courses, I'm quite sure, don't remember which ones, maybe constitutional law even, I don't remember, but the second summer I know where I was. I was at Lorton Reformatory for Men. The Lorton Reformatory for Men was Washington, D.C.'s prison. And I started in the second year of year 2, year 3, right? 3 years, yeah. That second semester of year 3, I was already in Lorton. It was my clinic program. And the interesting thing about the program, among many other interesting things, is that it had enough credits that I could graduate 3 years and 2 summers if I took that second semester in Lorton. So I spent 2 semesters at Lorton. And talk about being enlightened, I was again enlightened. I had a lot of sympathy for, this is not going to come out quite the way I mean it, but I was not afraid of criminals, and I could, being a sociologist and psychologist at heart, I had a certain amount of compassion, not necessarily forgiveness, but I could understand the mind, and I was very interested in rehabilitation of the criminal mind. So I had all these ideas when I went to Lorton Reformatory. And I was in with the inmates, I don't know what they called them then, I guess, I don't know, in everything it's the first level of incarceration. I was in medium and maximum. Never got to the first one. The problem I had the most was with the medium, believe it or not, because they were well behaved enough that I think there was a lot of looking the other way by prison personnel, and it was challenging at points. I'm not going to necessarily go into all of that, but very challenging. And I began formulating a view that there was a lot of collaboration between prison and prison guards. Not all of them, but that there was some stuff going on that wasn't healthy, I'll put it that way. But I defended my clients. I was there to help them avoid getting their good time revoked. Good time meant you were really good in prison, but you did something bad, like, I don't know, you had a drug or whatever. And before they could take away the good time, the prisoners were entitled to due process hearing. By that time, I had been interested in a lot of due process stuff, and thinking, that came later. But I was thinking that there was something I was doing even before I became a lawyer in due process issues. So I represented them before usually a panel of guards, and sometimes successfully and sometimes not. But I met with them and in interesting environments, some of which, as I said, were challenging. I learned to take it easy if I was going to be searched. I was never strip searched, however, but we were searched.
If you had
not by the prisoners,
right.
By the guards. Sorry. I better make that clear. I better make that clear for posterity. Who knows what they know about any of this?
If you could perhaps describe it in a phrase or a sentence, what your primary takeaway was in this kind of contact with prisoners, what would it be?
My primary sense of I guess my first sense of it, the change that was evoked in it was I no longer thought, I no longer believed that if I were to encounter someone with a criminal mind, particularly someone who was intent on carrying out a criminal act, I was not going to be able to reason them into behaving properly. That's what I came out with. The social worker in me changed. Now, it didn't last forever, but I thought it was a dosage of reality that was probably important. Not because I was going to go taking myself out into the depths of the criminal world, but something you need to know about, particularly as a lawyer and a judge, as it turned out. The fact was that by the time when I graduated from law school, my first year as a lawyer, I decided to be a defense lawyer for criminals in Fairfax, although I had some even in the federal court. I wasn't afraid to do it, but I did understand something about my personal relationship with people who I might encounter who might wish to do me harm or my kids harm or something. You know, I really thought that was important. I'm not the kind of person to hide from reality either. I mean, I'm not afraid of it, but I just had this sense that people were able to be changed and rehabilitated, but not everybody. There is a small group. I learned that some criminals don't have a conscience. That's where the rubber hit the road, if I can use the vernacular. I think that group is a tough group. I still think to this day, though, that I would work with them. I may or may not do this, but there's a program in Fairfax. They need people, not usually judges. They'd love to have judges, and not too many go. In fact, I think I only know one who did, maybe more than one. But they want people to meet with juveniles who, informally, just to talk to them. See, this kind of attracts me because I think people can be rehabilitated, and I think that's where you start. I think you start with the kids. So it didn't change me forever exactly in terms of how I conducted myself even in my law practice. It just gave me a new insight.
What year did you finish law school?
78.
And did you take your bar exam before you finished?
No. I spent that summer studying without break almost, and practically memorized the whole. We had these books that could study from that were examples of prior exams, and I just memorized everything I could.
Was this the DC bar or the
It was
Virginia bar?
Mm-hmm.
And so you envisioned your career as focused on Virginia.
I did.
Were you thinking Northern Virginia or just anywhere in Virginia?
Probably Northern Virginia, but I think if someone had asked me if I might be interested in practicing somewhere else, I might have said maybe. But we were by then rooted in Northern Virginia. Mm-hmm. Joe was still working at the Pentagon. No, he was then maybe with Office of Management and Budget, I think. The executive branch by then. We had the house. We had the 3 kids in school, certainly. Now much older. What were they then? Christine was 1 when I started law school, so she was then 4, and the others were 8 and 9.
Were you interested in joining a large law firm, a corporate law firm? What were your interests by the time you got to your last year of law school?
And it never occurred to me to join a corporate law firm. I didn't think I was in a position to do that. But I did think, while still in law school, that I would love to do something for the Justice Department, mostly in tax. Who would have believed? I thought, well, this could be fun. I could work at the IRS, or, I liked the tax class I had, but I had a lot of interests of that sort. Like, I liked civil procedure. I liked the UCC. I mean, I don't know why, but I thought maybe I'd do something, but I couldn't. My kids were very young, and we didn't have the support that young families have now when they're both working. So I thought, well, let me just write to the law firms here. They then were small. The largest was maybe, I don't know, 14, maybe 20. But I just wrote to everybody I knew. by then I had a lot of connections in the community, some of whom were lawyers. But of course, in the tradition of Sandra Day O'Connor and Ruth Bader Ginsburg, nobody would hire me. So I was in good company.
Is that because you were a woman?
I don't know. They should have hired me, I think, but they didn't. I have some of the letters of rejection. I've been just cleaning out a lot of stuff because I'm changing from a full-time, really full-time senior judge over to something else. I started looking at, and there are some letters that I got from people that I later had, became colleagues. But anyway, so I did what I thought was the most reasonable thing anyway. I think I may have been happy I was not hired because I wasn't sure how I was going to handle the kids. So I hung out my shingle. It got to be, there were people who gave me sort of ad hoc contract jobs in the meanwhile, people that I did know, and had some interesting jobs involving one of those Mercedes cars that was a lemon, and I had another one involving defamation, but just working on contract for people that I knew, lawyers that I knew. But the more interesting thing that happened is looking around Fairfax City, either going to the library or just looking for people to perhaps give me some leads. I did run into someone who helped me out, and that was the woman, attorney then, who had been my adjunct professor in legal research and writing. And I did very well in her class, and she was looking for someone to help her with that lemon law vehicle thing. And she said, well, why don't, I need someone to do some of the research and writing, and why don't you come and help me with that? So we did. I did. She's fascinating. She did mostly family law. Great lawyer, absolutely superb lawyer, and research and writing, really knew how to do it. So we did. We were in the federal court. The attorney who represented the car ended up being a colleague of mine later on the Fairfax bench because he was with a big firm, right? And it was interesting. We lost. We did. We lost. But I didn't lose because she said, I have this office. I have a conference room that if you want to meet clients in, you're welcome to do that. You can use my secretary. You can have the word processor, the telephone, the whatever. And periodically I can give you a client or that I feel like I'd rather have you do, or you can do whatever you want. And you don't have to pay me any rent unless you earn some money. If you earn a fee, you have to pay me half. And I said, well, I think this is a great opportunity. I said, yes, this is part of my saying yes. And I said, sure, I think this is a great job. I mean, a great way to get started. So I did, and I had the flexibility, I had support. I was in a great office, all women. Carol Gaylor, the secretary, and I. Mary Ann Rose, I remember. And I would take a lot of court-appointed cases. I did a lot of pro bono. The biggest case I had, I earned not a fee because it was a Title VII case. I had no business taking it. But I told her I wouldn't even charge her unless we won, which you never do in a Title VII case.
Why is that?
Well, because it's so much work. And they're not like getting a contingency fee, really. But I was new, and I wanted to help her out, and I thought I would learn something, and I did, but didn't get too far. I did some interesting work, though. A lot of pro bono. A lot of juvenile court work. And in about 2.5 years of that kind of effort, and I was in court a fair amount, someone from a very well-recognized, not huge firm, because there was nothing huge in Northern Virginia then, really, compared to today, called me up and said, would you be interested in talking to us about joining the firm? By then, my kids were 3 years older, and I had been working for about 3 years, still not making enough money to support myself, probably. So I did. I met with them, and they hired me. And there, being a woman probably helped. Everyone at that time, and there were almost no women in the law firms. Certainly, I don't know that there were any women who went to court. I think that's what made Barbara Keenan so interesting, because she was, as a prosecutor, was in court a lot. I've forgotten, I know our paths crossed at some point. So, but most firms didn't have a woman, and this was a firm that wanted to have a woman. And I had already quite a history behind me.
What firm was this?
Hall, Saraville, Jackson, and Colton.
And how many partners were in that firm?
Well, those four, certainly, probably 5. Another one, thinking there's one that was not in the name, 6, probably 6, I'm thinking 6. And everybody else was an associate, and I was their first woman associate. And then my career changed again, because they hired me to do, lots of things, but I made it clear I didn't want to do either criminal or family law. I had already been doing quite a bit of that, and I didn't want to continue. I didn't want to grow a career in either of those fields, especially, well, I can't, both of them. I didn't want to be a criminal defense attorney and, or a family lawyer either, so much.
Why is that?
Too confining, probably. I'll go back to my first theory. I thought the family law issue was a way of defining me in a biased way. And I think a lot of women would agree with that. I mean, if you're going to, in other words, that's the career you have as a woman. It's turned out not to be so, by the way, certainly in the latter years. I mean, some of the best family, I'll call it domestic relations lawyers, are male, and they are absolutely phenomenal. And they're making a lot more money than I ever would have made doing anything else. If that's a consideration, you probably sound like I'm thinking about money, but you know, which I'm not. I wouldn't have been doing some of the things I did if that were the consideration. But if that had been a consideration, I probably should have done it, you know. Could have been a nice income. But I thought it was too confining, too defining, and I didn't tell you about my marching for the ERA and some of the women's rights issues I had been involved in before all of that. No, I was well into that mindset. And it's a hard practice, by the way. Representing families in a divorce context is probably the hardest work that any lawyer would have to do. And that's why they deserve every penny that they earn. It is extremely hard, and the effects can be very healing, but they can be also pretty bad. And it can be a very a risky environment to work in as well. Same thing with criminals. But I never had a problem with criminals. I only had problem with, I didn't ever had a problem with anyone really, but I never felt sort of uneasy with a criminal in the room, as long as there's a guard there. But even without, the criminal, I never met a psychopath. I never had to work with a psychopath. But that's getting to a different group. So I decided I would go there, and when they gave me law that involved family law, I kept reminding them, you said you wouldn't do this to me. And I did take a couple of criminal cases, one of which I couldn't resist, couldn't say no to, because it just was too interesting. Again, I hadn't had experiences with these kinds of people. And briefly, because there's too much to the story, way too much. But I was sitting in my office, and someone called me up and said they wanted to meet with me to help with her boyfriend who was in jail on a rape charge. And I said, well, you know, I'm not doing much criminal law. And in fact, I think it might have been, I actually think it wasn't. It was the alleged criminal, perpetrator. He called me. And I thought, well, gee, this is kind of curious. And he says this, well, I'm already represented by an attorney, and actually we were in court, and we saw you in court, and we think you should join the team. Of course, I was already getting a little suspicious, and of course I knew I couldn't do anything anyway, represented by an attorney. And I said, well, you know, I don't think this is something I should be getting involved with. You have an attorney. I cannot represent you. He said, oh no, the attorney wants you in. It just goes on and on. You just can't imagine. You know, it was a rape case, and They probably wanted me in for all the wrong reasons, even though they might have thought I handled myself well in court. But the next thing that happened after I talked to the attorney who represented him is I had to collect the fee. I set up a fee that was probably the highest fee I ever set in that, because I figured they would get the point not to come. But the next day, someone came to my office with the fee, and it was all cash.
Wow.
I mean, it was kind of scary.
So did you win the case?
Too long a story. I don't know if winning is, there was not, the cash was not, well, I can't get into there either, but because it came out of his girlfriend's cash, who probably had earned it illegally, and probably in prostitution. I mean, I've been exposed to all kinds of strange folks for someone who comes up from a background that I grew up in, totally protected, so shy in high school she thought she had to become a cheerleader to be able to speak to anybody, you know what I mean? It's crazy. The case went out on a technicality, on a speedy trial motion that the real lawyer in the case, the guy who represented this man all along, figured out what I never would have figured out. It had to do with the complaining witness, who was also into prostitution, and we went to trial, and that day she didn't show up. She had a doctor's note saying she couldn't come to trial. So of course I'm thinking, I gotta finish this. I have to move on to the rest of my life. I don't want to do this work, but we have to get this trial done. So we're walking out of the courtroom, and I say to the male attorney, I mean, he had been dealing with these kinds of issues. Well, he was much older than I, and even though I was not young at the time either. He says, I said, really, when are we going to get this over with? And this is terrible, really. He goes, I said, something about, I wonder how sick she is and what this really means. He goes, I'm putting our detective on her. I said, what are you talking about? Exactly. So he did. And it turned out she had lied. And so, because procedurally he had figured out, I would never have figured this out. I'm just an observer by this point. He had figured that if he put on a speedy trial motion, because by that time the time had passed, it would come to a fore, and that's exactly what happened. So he put on the speedy trial motion, and they had to put on the complaining witness, and they put on the detective, and the prosecutor said, "Null pros." Interesting. I have a lot of stories like that, but we're not going to go there anymore, unless you ask me the right question. Fascinating. I got to be that firm's primary legal researcher and writer for the tort group, which included Bob Hall, and an attorney named William Sneed, called Sandy Sneed, who was probably, they are both two of the finest civil litigators in the state. And they wanted me to do their research and writing I had motions practice. By that time, I was already on the Planning Commission, Fairfax County. I remember this so well because the Planning Commission met Tuesday and Wednesday nights every month but August, and Friday was the motions practice. So if you're lucky to get out of Planning Commission by midnight Thursday, that's the way it went. I was doing a lot of stuff. It was hard. But I did it because this is going backwards. I did it because I learned in my first case that there was something I would like to do that I was really interested in, and it was to go on the bench. My first case in juvenile court. And I didn't think I had any hope. If you haven't put it together yet, I was 38 when I graduated from law school. No firm would hire me. So I had no firm behind me, and you need some larger group of lawyers somewhere along the line. And I didn't think, as a woman, with no trial or limited trial experience or any other experience, I would get there. And everything that came my way all fit into creating enough of a background that people would have to say, my goodness, I was counsel to the Civil Service Commission. I ran their due process hearings. I did land use. I met all kinds of lawyers who then knew me. And I was in the court every Friday doing motions practice and doing legal research and writing for the firm. That's what I did.
What made you want to be on the bench? You said that this happened.
Interesting. I think I just was pulled to, I like solving problems more than presenting them. I don't mind creating problems, by the way, but I don't like presenting them, apparently, as a lawyer. And if I really, and now you, since you're asking me, it is not my personality to be adversarial in that way. I can be. I'm not afraid to challenge people on things that I feel need to be challenged. I had a whole history of, causes and stuff. But I just thought it was better to be part of the solution. And I felt it was more in keeping with my personality, which was more problem solving, contemplative perhaps. I didn't think about the appellate court necessarily. I think about the trial court, really. And that's where I started. But I worked 11, let's see, how long was it did I work? I think 11 and a half years, doing very interesting things. I thought myself personally, thought the more background I had, the better I would be if I ever got to the bench. So I garnered as much experience. I could have gone earlier than I did, but I thought, no, let's try a little bit more of this, because it's interesting, I'm learning. So that's what I did. I ended up with a major firm in the district, by the way, to finish that a little bit. I became a lawyer with Dickstein, Shapiro, and Morin of counsel. I was their mostly their regulatory and land use person. But if we had litigation, I did that. I was only there 2 years, and I was elected to the Circuit Court of Fairfax.
Was this something that you lobbied for?
Which?
The circuit court position.
Well, lobbying.
When I say lobbying, you let people know you were interested.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I did, but it was different then. It was a lot simpler. You had to fill out an application, and letting the local delegation was what had to be done. And so I did. And a lot of them knew me already for one reason or another, and knew me enough that I was concerned that they wouldn't be evaluating me on merit. I remember this very clearly because I ended up in each of the conversations I had with them, which was primarily by phone, I think almost all by phone. I said, I want you to know something. If I don't get the bar's recommendation, I don't know if I said high recommendation, I may have even said that, but I said probably recommendation, I'm going to withdraw my name because I just don't want to do it any other way. So that's what I did, and I got the recommendation, or at least a good one, and I went on the bench, Fairfax County.
And so what year was that?
Interesting. That was 1989. Mm-hmm.
Now, you've been extremely busy. What
Mm-hmm.
was happening on the family side? You're balancing the law practice,
Mm-hmm.
all of your external
Mm-hmm.
extracurricular activities with raising 3 children.
Yeah.
And of course having a husband. So what was that like for you?
It was really hard. I think the children, I had expressed what this was all about fairly early on, because I knew I was going to be very busy, and even if I had had help, it still would have come out to the same thing. I think as a parent, you still have to be very engaged. But I hearkened back to my family, my family of origin, so to speak, my nuclear family in New Jersey, and the fact that they had come across the sea to set up this family that was supposed to achieve, succeed, progress. I've forgotten what words, but it's along those lines. And that I told my 3 daughters that I expected them to carry on the tradition, that I thought, and my sisters had been doing that, and my brother as well, of course, and that the family as a whole, cousins and everybody, we had all kind of bought into it, some with more success than others, but generally in that thrust, and with that thrust. And that I expected them to play that role, that they were responsible for doing it, and they would have to conduct themselves in that way. Well, it sort of worked. It worked generally. There were years, there were times or days, then I thought, oh gosh, this is not going to go. But they all succeeded. They had to take a fair amount of responsibility. And not that they didn't have a childhood, and not that they didn't have fun, and not that I didn't have a couple of them that kind of did things that I didn't think they should be doing. I don't think they were illegal, however, but they, you know, they knew one thing: if they were supposed to be at home and they weren't, Mom would find them, no matter where in Fairfax County they were, and I did. So I had that kind of tie. My husband was a lot more relaxed. He thought they were going to be fine. They did well. They all have graduate degrees. It wasn't always linear, but pretty much so, actually. I think I'm very proud of how they figured out how to put their lives together. And they all, I didn't press any of them for following any particular route. I did talk to them a little bit about medicine, but never said, I think you should go into medicine. That's because I wanted to be a doctor. I'm glad I'm a lawyer, actually. Too confining. Medicine is always the same thing every day. So one is an environmentalist, and with a master's degree from GW, 3 years in the Peace Corps, Senegal, West Africa, I think I mentioned that. And now it works in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, for the city of Portsmouth, doing block grants and community development, urban development. Second girl is a veterinarian. Had graduated with a degree in psychology, and then 2 weeks later said she wanted to go to vet school. Pointed out she didn't have any science courses. So I've got it all figured out. I'm going to work for a vet here, and I'm going to take all my science degrees at Northern Virginia Community College or George Mason and go. And she did. She's a vet, married to a vet. And my third daughter, who was the youngest, 4 years, she was 1 when I went to law school, is a reconstructive ocular and facial reconstructive plastic surgeon. It's such a long. She does plastic surgery to reconstruct faces that have been damaged either through accident or disease. Long training, of course. They all have, as I said, graduate degrees, and not a single one is a lawyer. And even though I had a malpractice practice, medical, they weren't afraid to go into medicine, which I thought was really good. It says a lot about me more than about them. They knew that, you know, mistakes could be made, but that in the practice I was in, we tried to be very fair about it, reasonable, and make good judgments. So that's what they do.
So switching back to your role on the bench.
Yes.
What was, in terms of your circuit court experience, what was your most challenging experience on the bench?
In the circuit court?
Yes.
Oh, what's the most challenging? Gosh.
And it doesn't have to be a case.
No, I understand. I'll mention a couple of things. I'll mention this first, I think. There's a long learning curve to be a judge. I don't care when you get to it and what your background has been, because in Fairfax, we didn't sit in divisions, so every day was a different substantive area of the law. So not only was there a long learning curve, for me that was wonderful because I'm a generalist to begin with, but it was challenging. But because of that, in part, I kind of changed the culture there because I took things under advisement, which really raised eyebrows, and made some people kind of upset, I think. Because trial judges don't take things under advisement, usually. They just make a decision and go on. But I had issues that I didn't take the evidentiary issues under advisement, typical stuff that would keep the trial going on. Well, I may have done even that, I don't think so. I took issues that had not been fleshed out at an appellate level sufficient for me. Some of it was there in writing already. Some of it wasn't clear enough. And the lawyers, I thought, the parties really, were entitled to know the reasons. I could have decided many a case right there on the bench, or even decided it on the bench without writing, even later. People have done that. But I was very, and there was someone else before me who had done something like that, and we had talked about it, and I felt very strongly about it. I was very committed to giving reasons, and even orally, but I thought it was better in writing. I think you could do it better, and I think people need to have it. And I thought the lawyers needed to have it for their records and their thinking, and I thought the appellate courts needed to have it. I mean, I figured if they were going to reverse me, they should at least have something to look at. Because you don't get those reasons. I know on the appellate bench we don't always get that reasoning. We just, you do. But I think it's your shot in the trial bench to say, look, this is my reason. Yeah, you might have a case. I said, this is my reason as to why I'm not going to be bound by that. It was interesting. So I wrote. That was challenging. Now, when did I write? Well, I couldn't write while I was on the bench, right? And I didn't leave the bench early to write, so I wrote in my leisure time. Yeah. And we did have some law clerk help, not a lot, but we did. And I'll tell you, the most interesting thing was that at the same time, Hamilton Bryson, whom you probably know, is a law professor, was interested in publishing circuit court cases. There were very few. And I remember looking at the Fairfax County Library. Maybe he directed me there. I mean, I would look for some of those cases, obviously. I didn't want to do all this writing, if there were any cases anywhere. And, these long library shelves, in the beginning, I don't remember, there couldn't have been more than maybe 20. He would say fewer, I think. He thought there was nothing published, hardly. But by the time I left the circuit court, there were rows, because other judges began to write too. I think there may be less of that now. Some of that gap may have been filled in. So I wrote a lot.
Why do you think you and perhaps other judges were starting to do that, to write
Well,
more?
I think for the same reasoning. I remember I will mention the judge who also had the same philosophy. And I know we talked about it once. Maybe it was after I began writing, maybe it was before. I'd like to ask her sometime. It was Judge Barbara Keenan. When she got on the circuit court, I know she was doing some writing. Excuse me. No, I don't think it was writing. She would give the reasoning orally. I'm pretty sure that's what it was. I'm trying to but that was the thrust of why people were doing anything that was more than, I find you guilty, or $100,000, whatever, for your contract breach or whatever. She was reasoning on the bench. I think I may have had a case in front of her. So it may have been before I was on the bench myself. But it was unusual, and distinctive. So when I got on the bench myself, I knew I could write. Nobody said I couldn't write, although some people thought it was kind of strange. I must tell you, it didn't stop me, apparently. That's what I did.
Well, you perhaps had more experience writing than some of the other.
Well, no question. Yeah, I think so. It took a lot of work, and I was willing to spend the time doing it. I don't know how I squeezed everything in, but I never I had many years, even before the bench, when I was quite happy to, I never got more than 6 hours of sleep. I didn't need a lot of sleep. It turns out now there are some people who genetically don't sleep much. And I mean, the kids were functioning pretty well. I did have one daughter who did the cooking, not because I asked her to, but she liked it. Everybody did laundry. Husband spent a lot of time making sure. He had a busy job too, though, but the kids, obviously were important to him as well. We actually went to soccer games. We had one member of our family, one daughter, who was on a visiting team, so we were beyond Virginia. We did all of that. Anyway.
What was perhaps your most challenging case?
Challenging case? Well, I'll give you one, maybe two. One, because it was a writing challenge. And it was because I had a case that I wanted to treat a little bit tongue-in-cheek. It involved violation of criminal law. It was the local law having pigs. Did I tell you about this case? No? Maybe I shouldn't tell you then.
Please.
This man had a Vietnamese pot-bellied pig, and it couldn't have been more than, 10, 12 inches wide, a little chubby. And he kept it in his parlor. And there was a Fairfax County ordinance that said you couldn't keep a pig in a hog pen that was closer than, I think, 10 yards from a residence, or abode. I think the word was abode or dwelling. So, of course, he was charged with a criminal violation of the municipal law, and he was found guilty in the General District Court. But he didn't like that decision, so he appealed. And I get the case, right? And I don't know, there was something about it that just tickled me. And
Now, this pig was his pet.
it was his pet. He kept it in the parlor,
Yeah,
though.
yeah.
It was small. It was like a little dog. So I had the case and listened to all the argument, looked at the law. He brought the pig in. We kept him outside on the grass. He had him in a big red, white, and blue bow. His argument was, this thing is not bigger than a small dog. What is the problem, right? Well, I guess I should confess to having found him, I did find him not guilty, but it took an interesting bit of writing. I looked at it again 2 days ago, and I wondered if I made some horrible mistake. If there's ever a result-oriented decision, this is the only one, ever. I mean, I've looked at a lot of my stuff. This is the only time that arguably it was result-oriented. But I don't really think so. And what I did is I wrote up a 2-page opinion, and I used all the literature on pigs that I thought I could fit in. Such pigs in a home, like this little piggy went to market. No, I know. I'm sorry. This little piggy went home. You better. I know, you better not put this part in. And I quoted, I probably need a break.
It had to be written.
I probably need a break. But honestly, I quoted Charles Lamb. Do you know the story about roast pig? No. It was about this Chinese family that kept pigs in their home. But one day, the house got on fire. This is a really well-known, for people like me in literature, really essay on roast pig by Charles Lamb. I think I got the right guy. The house caught on fire, and I guess the kids got something. They were touching, to see if the pigs burned up in the home. But after they touched the pig that was burnt up, they put it in their mouth. And boy, did it taste good. And so thereafter, in this little village, according to this essay on roast pig, there were regular house fires that nobody could explain. It was all because they had kept this pig in the house. And finally, there was a Supreme Court case by, I think the Justice of Sutherland, and he was working on some sort of a land use case right up my alley by that time. I had been in land use. I had run across this. It's something like this. A pig in the parlor, which is what we had, a pig in the parlor instead of the barnyard may be the right thing at the wrong time. Something along those lines. So I put all three of those into the decision. And I reasoned that this was not a hog pen that was 10 yards away from the abode. It was in the abode, and being a criminal case, it has to be construed really against the Commonwealth, and you have to have real articulable, reasonable notice. So I said, the way the law was written, it didn't say anything about keeping a pig in the parlor. It said something about keeping it in a hog pen 10 yards away, and I reversed it. It went all over the country. It got picked up at my AP, and even the prosecutor thought it was fine. What can I say? It was a very challenging case, and in terms of writing it, that made sense, but had a little tongue-in-cheek. You only do you only have an opportunity for that once in your whole life as a judge. You write too many of those, and people think you should be off the bench. I never wrote another one. And
sounds like the beginnings of a good children's story.
True enough. Maybe I should. I don't know if they're all challenging in many ways, and I think this other one had to do with family life education that was being challenged in the court because there was a certain group in the community that was absolutely dead set against family life education being taught to their children. It's similar. These issues still are with us. They are people who feel it's a matter of personal choices and that kind of thing. But the county had done everything they could to do this properly. This very group had opportunities to comment on why they didn't. There was every opportunity to opt out. Nobody was being forced. The biggest issue was having to do with premarital relations, of course, and the big argument was they wanted all the moral teachings to be there, and believe it or not, Fairfax County, that was part of the curriculum, absolutely clear about how, immorally, I don't know if they use the word immoral, but premarital sex was considered to be really inappropriate. I don't get the right words. But they had touched on all the bases. And so I had a case that was pretty highly publicized on a very important issue involving personal choice and privacy in a county that I thought had done the right thing and it took a while to write it out, to go through all the steps that had been taken. And I did that. And that was challenging for a lot of reasons. This is my county, and I had 3 children in the same classrooms as everybody else. I understood the issue. I had some sympathy for it. I didn't think they were crazy or off the wall, but they were not happy.
So how many years were you on the bench? On circuit court?
Yeah, 80. I hope I have my dates right. I think I got on the bench in 95. At the appellate bench. Was that 6 years? Yes. I left before the second term. I don't remember going back to the General Assembly for reappointment to the circuit court. I'm pretty sure I didn't, actually.
So talk about this transition.
The transition, yeah. The transition.
How did it happen?
Let's see, that was similarly done, except for one other aspect. The same thing, you apply, but the local delegation had a different role to play. When in Fairfax, in the Fairfax court, the local delegation, basically, that was it. If they said yay, the Courts of Justice Committee went with the recommendation. But at the appellate level, it was a statewide seat, and there were other considerations, including which geographical area everybody was on, so forth and so on. So I had to really reach out to a larger group. I did go down to the General Assembly. I never did that in Fairfax. I never did anything like that. I never went down to talk to people. I was available locally, and they, of course, interviewed me, and the bars weighed in, and I knew a lot of them. I knew people on both sides of the aisle, by the way. It wasn't just on one, although maybe some on one side knew me better. But I had worked with a lot of people in the community. So I went down to the General Assembly and tried to talk to all these folks that I didn't know. But I did run into one from Fairfax that I did know. And he said, in fact, I was just leaving. I thought, oh, this is going to be useless. I was leaving. I was in the elevator. And I got down to the ground floor, and he walked in to the elevator.
And
he
who
said,
was this?
It was Dick Saslaw. And I said, hi, Dick, nice to see you. He said, what are you doing here? I said, well, I'm going to put my name in for the Court of Appeals slot. And he said, oh, don't leave now. Let me take you to meet Tommy Norman, whom I didn't know. I said, okay. So forget about leaving. No, didn't go home. And I did. And so he started introducing me to people I didn't know on both, wherever they were. And I thought that was interesting and useful, frankly. And I had to put in, I'm quite sure I had to put in some written material. I don't remember which ones, but I know I must have, and the usual application of what I had been doing. But the big, I don't know if this is really true, but I think it's true. But they kept reminding me that a lot of this was trade-off. And it just turned out that the year I wanted to go on the Court of Appeals, Lawrence Coons wanted to go on, I was drawing a blank for a minute, Lawrence Coons wanted to go on the Supreme Court. So the two legislators got together, and that's what happened.
Now, what made you want to go on the Court of Appeals? What was it that was, no pun intended, appealing to you?
Probably, well, I think it probably was the research and writing. And I guess perhaps I was at a point where I, again, wanted to learn new things. I can't say I was really bored in the circuit court. I still sit in the circuit court. Even now, I did even when I was full-time with the Court of Appeals. Once in a great while, I'd go to the circuit court because they needed help and we could. And since I've become a senior judge, and now not a senior judge at all, I have called and said, you know, do you need help? I'll come down. It's an interesting court. Not only is it interesting, I still think, other than the juvenile court, it is the most difficult job of all the jobs I have ever had, appellate or otherwise, and even the non-court related jobs.
Why is that?
Well, I think it has to do with the nature of the problems that you encounter there, the fact that the litigants are right there, and the issues are so close to what life is all about. I mean, and just so much of it in family law, criminal law, even the commercial cases, all the cases, the homeowners cases where somebody really wants to put up a fence and the issues are so emotional, and it's at a time in the evolution of the problem that the emotions are pretty raw, and it's difficult for them. Testifying in a trial court is among the most difficult things anybody would ever have to do. And you have to manage a lot of people. I managed a lot of people on the Planning Commission, but I didn't, you know, the lawyers, the developers, all the citizens who said yay and all that said no. But then you have a jury, you know, that also has to be involved in the decision making, and it just goes on, and the rules are complicated. The evidentiary rules are complicated. And like the 3 jobs that I've had now where I am the final decision maker for all intents and purposes, the circuit court is pretty much the decision maker. It is the final resolution because people can't afford, and even if they can't, winning on appeal is not easy and often is not the result. I don't have the statistics, but I know what I see in my court. The Court of Appeals is itself the final decision making in most cases. And as an arbitrator, it is the really most underscored final decision making in people's lives in resolving their problems. And it is it's a heavy load. But taking the evidence and having to decide credibility is mind-boggling. Well, maybe that's not the right description, but it really requires a lot of energy and a lot of attention and filtering through. Some of it is surely must involve what every judge knows, which is making sure you're not reacting out of biases. Every judge knows that's something they have to monitor. It takes a tremendous amount of energy. At the appellate level, there isn't a whole lot of bias in the briefs I'm reading, unless they're poorly written, but even then I can get around it. I know how to read what I need to read. You know, you're not dealing with the people. Even if you, I like all the lawyers I usually work with, even if you think they haven't done a good job, it's never in the mix, really, for me. I've done too much research and writing to have that in the mix. You know, I'm so focused on words. If you ask me cases or lawyers who argued them, I probably couldn't tell you, because my focus is always on the argument. And I don't, the style doesn't stay with me. Who argued it doesn't stay, well, I probably would remember the result if you tell me the issue. But even in the course of deciding, my focus is quite narrow. In the trial court, it's all open to the people. It's more like mediation only in the sense that it's very people-oriented, and you are really you're really in relationship in a way. Even as a judge, you may be just listening, but it's different relationship.
How long of a learning curve did you have when
In the trial court?
Well, when you went from trial court to, well, let's deal with all of it. When you went from being a practicing attorney to circuit court judge, and then from there to appellate judge.
I think the learning curve was the longest going from lawyer, well, the longest was becoming a practicing attorney, because everything was really new and I was jumping into things that took a lot of work. But I laid the groundwork that I still probably use. I call it learning the geography or the topography of the law. And I'd come to the law library in Fairfax, and I would read everything on the point of law that I could find, even if it didn't necessarily relate to the resolution, because I was still learning everything that I needed to learn for that particular issue.
Was that part of your Yale training?
I don't know. I think it's part of my personality. I'm either obsessive compulsive, or putting it in a better way, sort of. I'm a perfectionist. So I want to know it all, and I'm interested. I mean, I really want to know. You can't keep doing that forever, but I still like to research everything I can get my hands on. So that was a long curve, but I only had to do it. Well, I had to do it one case at a time, which was much slower then. I didn't have a really big, full-blown practice. I could spend the time learning. The circuit court was different. Every day I had to learn something new. And how long? Well, I think as a lawyer, I always said it took me 3 to 5 years to feel reasonably comfortable, but then I went on the bench, in the 6th year. So I was back to having to learn substantive areas that I had never practiced in. And you learn them. You have to learn them really fast. You spend time learning. a lot of, if the lawyers help you, of course. My problem there was I always wanted more than what the lawyers were teaching me, unnecessarily in many cases, but it was just my personality. It's not that they weren't, they want to focus on this issue. And I say, well, what's on either side of this issue? Maybe you're not the kind of person that goes to the library for a book and looks at every book on either side. That's the kind of person I am. I'll go to the library, and before you know it, I'm looking at stuff on the side as well. So I'm interested, and I spent the time learning. The learning curve maybe was longer for me in that sense. But my practice at that point was predominantly, if I don't count land use, which I did have in the circuit court, I had some labor and employment law from the Civil Service Commission that I'm still, on as their chair, still a lot of employment law. But it was mostly torts, products liability, very interesting big cases, and medical malpractice. And now I'm, with a lot of other stuff that I didn't necessarily see.
Now, this brings me to the question of the law clerks that
Yes.
you hired.
Mm-hmm.
So what were some of the characteristics that you were looking for in your law clerks, and what was the average length of time that you would employ a law clerk?
Well, I'll start with that second question first, because it never was more than a year by design, by my decision-making design, if you will. I felt that it was a good training ground for a new lawyer, and that it should be made available to as many lawyers as I could in the time frame that I was going to be on the bench. And so every year I would change law clerk. Now the problem with it, I think there's only 1 year I didn't do that. Let me think about that. I think it was just 1 year, maybe 2 at the most, but I think it was just 1. The problem with doing that is you then don't have the benefit of an experienced law clerk, which certainly makes the job a lot easier. It does. It's a learning curve for a new lawyer to come into the law clerk position, in which they are responsible for carrying on a fair amount of the research, practically maybe most of the research. It depends on how you do your law clerk training, if you will. And if my law clerks were good enough, and sometimes you couldn't even perceive this until several months down the pike, I'd have them do a first draft of an opinion, because it was training. So that was my practice, and I liked people who had a background in research and writing. The first clerk I had, which ended up being the best clerk I had, was the best writer I have ever seen anywhere. And he came out of George Mason, and it was so clear. I couldn't believe he had written it, but he did, because he kept writing like that the whole time he was with me. I earned him. Interesting people, men and women, and usually good work habits. They had to stay late if I had to go early, and they might have to put up with revisions and rewriting. You're talking to someone who finds 15 reiterations of an opinion par for the course. Now they all may not be the same, it might be 3 words here or whatever. But anyone who does any real writing knows it's all in the revising. So, my law clerks would have to do that, partly for training and partly for me. They have to read the record. They really have to help out in making sure I haven't missed something as well. There's so much to read. So it was a combination of things depending on their skills and their skill level, their talent, if you will. We talk about the cases, it's where I wanted to go with it. When I got to be a senior judge, I worked with the staff attorney's office, and I varied that approach. In the beginning, I didn't want to, I call it poisoning the well. I wouldn't want to say, well, look, this case is going to be reversed. Just make me draw it up, and I'll look at it. I thought it was more interesting for them if I didn't tell them. And I did that when I had my own clerks as well. It's harder for them, and it doesn't always work. The task when I was a senior judge and I was doing staff attorney is I felt I just wanted to do more of the writing, because not because they didn't have the skills, but because their load on different kinds of cases was really significant. So but they always did the factual part of the writing, and then I would add to it. But I never told them the result in the beginning. Then later I thought, well, maybe it's easier for them if I say, I think this should be reversed. Sometimes I would say, I want you to write it both ways, because that's also a decision-making exercise. And I still write some things both ways. I just don't charge for it as an arbitrator. I just, I can't do that. But if I'm on a learning curve, I don't charge for that. You never think about that as a judge, because you just do your job. You get your salary, and whatever it takes, 10 hours, 20 hours, whatever it is, just do it.
When you're writing your decisions, how do you write them?
Oh, it depends. How do I write them? In what way? You mean, do I decide them first and then write them?
Well, some people want to type everything up. Some people want to feel the words by actually using a pen, or even certain types of pens. Some people approach it very different ways. Some people even use index cards. How do you write your decisions?
It's changed. I always hand wrote. Most of my either decisions or even my arguments when I was arguing as a lawyer, I handwrote it. But on, say, the circuit court, where eventually would be in writing, in print, if you will, I start with handwritten material. But over the course of time, on the Court of Appeals in particular, I think this is where it changed. I now work on the computer. But on the Court of Appeals, the difference is, unlike the circuit court, which was really a challenging writing exercise, someone's been doing some heavy work on briefs. They're the lawyers. And you can start with some of there are a couple of sources that are different. They're the briefs. I now have transcripts, particularly in arbitration, because this has really changed how I write. And I can grab whole portions of things that I want to put in an opinion, of testimony, for example, and just, it goes in electronically, I do a certain amount of cut and paste on law that I know is correct because I've checked it, or I take it right out of the case. I mean, if it's somebody's brief, take it right out of the case. If once I've gotten to the point of having checked it, that's the big part of writing. The big part of writing is making sure all the materials you have are correctly stated and pertinent, of course, relevant. And that takes a lot of time. And I don't do all of the checking at once. Sometimes I have to write an analysis of where I think the case is going or may go. Sometimes it's an analysis of the law, and I may have to go back and see if that really was the testimony. So it's a combination of sources. Do I write anything? Now, what happens after I have, let's say, a reasonably solid draft? I print it out, and then I write on it, handwritten. And I don't do another draft on the computer until I have handwritten something on that draft. Usually a lot, actually. It's not just something, it's usually quite a bit. A lot of it is editing, but editing sometimes sounds like, oh, well, we know what that means. But what it means is, in good part, is checking to see if analytically your decision-making is holding, it's cohesive. Does it really say what you want to say? And then sometimes it really doesn't. That part is maybe doing a second level of analysis, moving things, sometimes just moving things, sometimes it's taking out things that are totally wrong. It just gets to be quite comprehensive and complicated. I can tell you this, I never did that on the newspaper. No, you go out, you write your story, and you come back, and the deadline's at 2 o'clock. I worked on the afternoon paper, by the way, that used to have a morning and afternoon. No, that's different. It's a different kind of writing.
What made you decide to retire?
Okay. Well, I was thinking ahead at the time when I would be 70 years old. And I thought, do I really want to find myself on the bench at 70? Not did I want to work at 70, but did I really want to still be on the bench at 70 and not explore some other things I might do? And I thought, well, I'm not, I don't think so, but not that I had something I really wanted to do. And I actually thought I didn't want to do anything that involved judging or lawyering or anything, but I didn't have anything particular in mind. So I retired, and I did start doing some mediation and some arbitration. I did have an interest in some international work, and one of the reasons I went with JAMS, which is a national and international alternate dispute resolution service provider, arbitration and mediation, is because I had some idea that I might want to do international arbitration. In fact, I think I was introduced to JAMS because I went to a seminar in New York City on international arbitration, even before I got off the bench. I'm not sure how I got invited or why I went exactly. And I met a senior, so to speak, a well-established arbitrator there from JAMS who was doing international arbitration. And I got to talking. I was right next to him, sat right next to him, and he asked me, what I was doing there, and I said, well, I'm going to get off the bench someday, and maybe. He said, well, here's my card, and that's how I got to go with JAMS. Because when I started thinking about it, I thought, well, maybe I should try this. Maybe I'll do some international arbitration. The end of the story on that is I did do one international arbitration. It was the first arbitration I ever did, and it was just because of who were the other two people on the panel. They needed a third. They needed the chair. Now, mind you, I had never done any arbitrations internationally. It was here, fortunately. And I did that one, and I've never done another one.
Is there a reason why?
Yeah, there are two reasons. One, to really become an international arbitrator, I think most international arbitrators have had a long career as lawyers, in international work and arbitration, even as lawyers. And one. Two, my work that I do have, I was senior judge still, right? And what I have as mediator in arbitration is fine. I'm very happy to stay domestically. I don't necessarily want to travel all over the world arbitrating at this point in my life, so I'm happy with that. And three, probably, I'm not sure about this, I've thought about it. Generally, there are very few women in arbitration, and there are even fewer, I think, in international, but I'm not sure that's true. I've been to a couple of colloquiums or conferences on it. There are not that many. There are some, and those that are really good. It's just not the right time for me. I should have started at 20 instead of when I started.
Well, just a couple of last questions, and this is going back to your role on the Court of Appeals.
Oh, okay. Yes.
The people, the judges you were working with, what was that relationship like? Were there parts of that you liked? And I'm not talking about the personalities, but just the procedures or processes. And were there things that you did really like about it?
Yes, I would say all of the above probably could be answered. There were things that I liked and didn't like, but I think let's start with the process a moment because it came right to mind. When I first got on the Court of Appeals, the decision-making was all in writing. We would exchange our proposed opinion or dissent. And I always found that very sort of odd because I think I was actually told we don't call each other, because I think it looked like we might be trying to sway people one-on-one, and it was supposed to be a panel decision. I think that's changed, and I don't agree with that view. I think not being able to talk one-on-one really was not helpful. It's still a panel decision because you still have to decide it in writing. So I think that's loosened up a bit. We did have a lot of discussion after the cases were argued, which I thought was absolutely on the money, but maybe not enough. And that's why the emphasis was on reviewing the analyses in writing. And that's still, I think, a good way to go, frankly. And without it, I don't think I think the U.S. Supreme Court, I'm not sure it's that court, they don't have a lot of discussion at all. And they just have to write something that they think is going to meet approval by their colleagues on the panel. I think that's really hard. But in any event, we have both. I like that. I don't know if there's anything. I like the fact that I was with a court that was the first Court of Appeals judge. I think almost everybody who at first, except the person I replaced who died. I mean, I replaced somebody, obviously. But it was the first Court of Appeals court in Virginia, and I thought they had done a terrific job in setting out procedures, both in terms of the rules of the court, their input there, the way they interrelated with each other, the fact that we sat in different parts of the state, the discussions on paper, I think it was a very respectful way of dealing with a court, both respectful in terms of the people on the court and the litigants and lawyers that we served, because we felt very strongly that it was a burden for the litigants and their lawyers to come from all parts of the world to a court that was going to be handling cases of the sort we were handling, both criminal and family law in particular, and workers' comp, actually. So I really thought they had done a very good job of developing a court that I think over the years has proved to be a superb way of decision-making, judicial decision-making. So I thought that was very interesting. A lot of strong personalities, a lot of difference of opinions on some issues, but everyone was pretty well willing to listen, I thought, and we always we had our power to dissent. So I didn't write a whole lot of dissents, but when I felt strongly, I did do that. I had the only curious, sort of funny episode that I can think of right off the bat is I had one judge who told me I couldn't wear a pantsuit to court. So I know that was kind of interesting. So,
What century was he in?
I don't know. But I figured I'd have bigger battles. And so I said, okay. So for several times when I sat with this particular judge, I didn't wear a pantsuit. I just wore skirts, and dresses. And eventually I said, I give up. I'm going to wear them anyway. So I did, and there was nothing said, and we went on. I mean, I don't know what the purpose of that was, but maybe he got used to me and realized that I was quite feminine, notwithstanding my trial attorney background. I don't know. It just went away.
Well, one of the things that struck me in looking at your material is that you were recognized in Who's Who for the prize of fighting for public justice.
Yes.
I want you to tell me a little bit about that.
That was the case that I handled as the Hall, Surville, Jackson, and Colton's primary research writer, legal argument giver person. And I started a case there with one of the partners who actually had come into the firm the same time I did, only he came in as a partner and I came in as an associate. And it was a medical malpractice case. And the issue was the malpractice cap that existed in Virginia. And they gave me the assignment of convincing the courts. We were in the federal court, by the way, with this case, a couple of federal courts. Now, one federal court, the other one we stayed in the state court, that the cap was unconstitutional. And so I did all the brief writing in this case that went to federal court, and in which I convinced the federal judge that the cap was unconstitutional. And that was enough to get me in their book, the Trial Lawyers for Public Justice, I think they're called, in their book called Cases and Lawyers That Make a Difference. Fighting for Justice, Public Justice, Trial Lawyers and Cases That Make a Difference. So our case got in there because based on the argument that the cap violated the right to a jury trial, the judge agreed. But interestingly, the Supreme Court of Virginia didn't agree. I don't know if that argument was actually made, but you know what happened. At the same time we had our case in federal court, there was another case here in Virginia, Supreme Court, and they found the cap constitutional. So that kind of wiped out the federal court ruling, and it wiped out part of our recovery, which was actually at the time the biggest verdict in Virginia. It just diminished it. It was an interesting journey. It was an interesting issue to pick on. I was not the first to think of it. I readily admitted that. There were a few cases in the west of the country, I've forgotten which states. I think maybe Indiana, maybe, where lawyers had been arguing the right to jury trial as a basis for challenging the cap. And I thought it was a really interesting and very good argument, and one federal judge agreed. So,
Well, now looking back over a varied career that's still ongoing.
yes.
So let's project this maybe 20, 30 years in the future. What do you want to be remembered? What aspect of your life that you want people to most remember about you?
The relationship I've had with them, period. On a one-to-one basis, probably. Either as a friend or as a mentor, to the extent I've mentored anybody, and or as a colleague, or as a parent, or a wife. Does that cover everything? Sister? I think that's probably the only thing that is worth being remembered by. Now, if I had written the great American novel, as I had once hoped, I'd have a different answer for you. But I haven't written it.
And that great American novel would have been on what topic?
Oh, let's see. Living in Paris, meeting, having to come home, leaving all my friends and colleagues there. I don't know, living a city behind that I really loved. And I don't know what it would be about. There is a book that's written something like the kind of book I would have hoped to write. It's very popular right now, called All the Light That We Cannot See. I think I've got the title. The Light We Cannot See, maybe, not All the Light. Very interesting. Very popular right now. It takes place in Paris. And the relationship is between a young French girl, who's blind, and a young German boy who's in the Hitler Youth. One in Germany, one in France. Very interesting. I don't know what it would have been about. It's about people, about relationship, all kinds of relationships, undoubtedly. Although, okay, one final comment on that. I don't read novels anymore. I just read nonfiction. So maybe it would have been something in nonfiction. Like, wouldn't I love to write a biography of Ruth Bader Ginsburg? Something like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, I look forward to the next chapter of your multi-chapter life. And I thank you so much for your interview.
You're very nice to say that. Thank you for your questions.
Thank you.